people. Welcome to the 2020 Vision Pro. This is part one. What this is basically a webinar exposition where we're going to be taking a look at the state of our vision or our perception of life today. This comes at the end of 2020, quite a year. And I think it's warranted to be taking a look at how things are going. So yeah, there's a lot to cover. I think we'll just dive right in. Right, so let me just screen share 1 second. And what I want to say basically is also, this is a really great opportunity for you all to be, this is great to be able to share this vision with you. So so this is part one, the 2020 Vision Pro, which the subtitle is a new meta paradigm for the structural elements of life system, or CELS. You will know that CELS is based off of my sales elements of life system, something I work with on an individual basis, and anyone will tell you that has worked with me that system sells. Talking about business revenue and basically kind of a life coaching, life kind of perception stance that I offer for anybody who's in a position basically for that kind of training. So I'm Daniel Baumann, chair of the 2020 Vision Pro and a thought leader in every sense of the word. There's a lot to cover on this first part, so I think we'll dive right in. Basically, part one is the structural elements of life system. We're going to be creating a foundation that we'll be able to build a theoretical application on a framework or armature. What that means is that we're going to be taking the structural elements of life system and applying it to the metaphor of life as a building. That is structural functional metaphorical analysis, which is basically taking life and breaking it down to different parts. And then what we'll be doing, kind of a reversal, is taking a look at the structural elements of life as a being. This is a post-structural, monolithic, functional, metaphorical synthesis. And what that's doing is taking life and putting it, all these elements of life, which we'll get to in part one or chapter one, and combining it into one being. So let's take a look at that. Part one, the structural elements of life system. Armature for theoretical application of CELS. So, structural elements of life system, what is it? And again, essentially it's exactly the same as the sales elements of life system. We have, what I'm going to say is kind of parts that speak to each other, kind of like a yin and yang situation, but cubed in terms of that there's like three different parts, or like a yin and yang sphere. That would be beginning and end, resource consumption and exertion, the non-material and material. This basically makes up all of life. I can tell you, I basically figured that out. This is what life is. Let me give you an example. That is the human life. I think that's what our primary interest is today. At the beginning, we have birth. With human life with resource consumption, we have sustenance. With the non-material, there's relations, that's like a religious space or family and friends, this immaterial connection in life. With the material elements of life for a human, we have our possessions. Christmas is coming up and we're all wondering what we're going to get. So that's kind of like what possession is. And then we arrive at exertion, which is production or work. That's kind of my playground or my sandbox. I deal with what people are, their productivity levels with work. Then at the end we have death, and that's just part of the human life, part of the whole system. So that's a good example for the structural elements of life. Let's move forward. 2, CELS as a building. That is the structural, functional, metaphorical analysis. And again, analysis is kind of taking a system and parsing it out into separate structures. So how we do that today is basically we're taking CELS and prescribing it to a building. We'll be looking at the building's different levels. That's how we're going to arrive at our complete system. And then we're going to assign functions to those levels of a building. We have a modern movement function, which is what I would call the past functions, and then the postmodern movement function, which would be contemporary. Let's take a look at the levels first. So we have the beginning, which is the basement. Think about beginning of life, we have like a warren or a den for animals, little critters, and that's underground, so it's kind of like a basement. Early life potentially could be like a cave as well, cavern, basically like a shelter place. With resource consumption, that's going to be the first floor. Think about the access point, entry or egress. Non-material, we have the second floor. And these are going to start to make sense, these different floors, as we move forward with our functions. With the material, we have the third floor. The fourth floor is occupied by exertion. And then at the end, we have our rooftop. The functions of these spaces. So at the basement, when you thought about the beginning, warren for animals, or cavern, is basically a nursery, and that's where life is raised. I also think about like a nursery or garden. So you think about flowers, plants, plant life, trees. They it starts in the ground and they grow up and out. Resource consumption, the first floor, remember we're talking about an access point, that would be a gas station. That would be, in the past, kind of starting at the modern time is, gas is sort of a resource. With the non-material, we have the religious space, as I mentioned before. It's kind of the intangibles of life. And then the material, we have a parking lot. This ties into the gas station for the car, and then a religious space for people. Exertion would be a factory. When we think about, in the modern times in New York, there was the pop art sensation Andy Warhol's factory, and it's about in modern times, again, it was about production levels and repetition. So I think that's important. And then at the end we have a mausoleum. So again, relating to death, mausoleum is basically a memorial to the past, memorial to those who have passed with interred remains. Funny story, when I was actually first developed the sales elements of Life System, I was a preteen, and I was in Washington, D.C. for a youth summit on leadership. We were in the United States Capitol holding a mock court system, essentially. What we did, so I was staying in Rosslyn, Virginia, and if you go there, Washington, Virginia is right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., across the Key Bridge. And if you go there, or even if you go there on Google, you'll see that in the town in the city there's a gas station that has a church built on top of it. And that kind of started this whole sales elements of design, or sales elements of life system in my head. And what I was thinking was, not how weird or bizarre that there's a gas station and a church on top of it, but I thought, what is this space missing? What does it need? And I arrived at the conclusion that what it needed was with the gas station below to charge up the cars, and then a church above to kind of reconstitute people's souls, or kind of recharge people's souls. Then there should be a parking garage to rest the cars, and then a cemetery on top of that to rest the human physical body. And yeah, that's as far as I got as a teen or a preteen. Today, what we see is kind of a final product here, where as well as the gas station and parking lot and mausoleum and the church, we also have a nursery below and a working space above, kind of complete the picture of life. Anyways, we can move on. So where that came from, the modern to postmodern, we arrived at the nursery becoming a shelter. After, there's a time of growth, then that still remains a safe haven, and that would be a shelter. with that first floor moving forward in time from a gas station to utility access in general, talking about like electricity and kind of charging station again. The second floor of non-material, I think it moves from religious space to recreational space. And I'm going to kind of go back and tie that in to what we have on the other levels. So with the material, the parking lot, which was like a physical holding space for vehicles, we then have an archive, which is a storage space for an organizational space for things like our human materials. With exertion, the factory moves forward into a lab. So I like to apply the concept of biopower, which was kind of created by Foucault. In that, there's a shift in power and concept of death. So society shifted from a faith-based system, preparing for death, against disease in the past. And I'm thinking about Gothic times. The church was the power source, or the moment, space of power, and life was about preparing for death. Then, with the advent of vaccinations and science with the lab, life, kind of the system of life or civilization shifted from the church preparing for death to kind of a government prolonging life. So there was the idea of life becoming about prolonging life instead of preparing for death, and that was a positive move. And so here we have the non-material church with the factory shifting to a recreation space with the lab, because there is that shift in power. Similarly, with the rooftop, which is again our area of death, essentially, the mausoleum kind of steps away from death a little bit to the social cenotaph. That is because the mausoleum would be a memorial with interred remains, and the social cenotaph is a memorial as well to death, but without the remains. Let's move forward. Part 3, cells as a being. And again, this is taking the structural elements of life system and combining it. And how we'll combine it is basically taking the structural elements of life system and looking at the signs of life. We think about if there's life on Mars, these are the things that scientists take into account to understand if some being or thing or essence is alive or not. Then we look at senses that define a life form. Finally, we kind of retire to the cognitive functions and elaborative cognitive functions, which is a scientific method. And I'll just note that in the 2020 Vision Probe, how we're kind of looking at our perceptions is by using the scientific method. So the signs of life. At the beginning, we have complex chemistry. And that's basically how life is begun. What I'm going to do? We're going to do two at once. So we'll look at the signs of life and the senses. So first we have complex chemistry, and then I'm tying that to hearing. So we have our basic sense of hearing. You think about beginning and hearing. Imagine that you're on a road and there's a bend in the road. So you can't see what's around the corner, but you hear something coming and you can tell it's a car. So I'd say that the sense of hearing is kind of the first warning system, if you will. And you hear that car, then you can see it. So moving forward with the resource consumption, a sign of life or resource consumption in a being would be growth. And tied to growth and consumption essentially would be the sense of taste. With our non-material elements of life, the sign of life would be homeostasis, which is essentially just existence, being in equilibrium. And I think that it's a nice element with the non-material. If you think about being at balance with family, friends, and in your with the spiritual element of life, essentially. And with a sense, that would be smell, which is again the kind of intangible. With the material element of life system, or part of the system, division of system, we have cells, which is again in the sign of life as a physical embodiment. And I'm not sure that cells, if we're thinking about life beyond the known universe and Earth. Cells may or may not be considered part of life, but as of today, it's a sign of life. Tied to that physical element is touch as a sense. With exertion, we have a response. So basically, it is if there's a life form that can respond. That also with senses is tied to vision. So with vision, basically, we're able to take action or have a reaction. Another kind of side of that would be volition, being able to have a vision and then create it. And we'll get into that with our cognitive functions. At the end, a sign of life would be genealogy or reproduction. Genealogy, I think, is applicable today more so than production or reproduction, because beings don't necessarily have to be able to reproduce. Beings can choose to reproduce, basically. With our senses, we're talking about a sixth sense here. And I would say that's basically everything outside of the known five senses, which I think warrants some space. Let's take a look at the cognitive functions. At the beginning, we have tied to perception of hearing and complex chemistry, perception, and then consciousness and unconsciousness. With the resource consumption, we have concepts, language acquisition, and cognition. So we think about consumption, the acquisition of language or concepts, that's taking in and learning, growing. With the non-material, we have reasoning, thoughts, and concentration. This is tied to, like the mental capacity, which again is immaterial. With the material, we have working memory. And working memory is different from memory, recollection, or long-term memory. It's more of memory in action. So if you're, say, baking a cake, your mind is able to align the steps in the order like live, basically. And that's the working memory. With exertion, we have, as I mentioned, with the vision and response, volition, and also an attention and orientation, basically intentions. That's tied to kind of, the production or work aspect of life. With our basic cognitive functions, finally, kind of looking back, we have judgment, emotions, and memory recollection. Thinking about end of life and being able to look back. And now let's move on to elaborative cognitive functions. These should align with our cognitive functions fairly well. So at the beginning, with perception and consciousness, unconsciousness, we have problem identification and exploration. I think problem identification is basically understanding a situation. Resource consumption would be decoding or selection of relevant information. If we're thinking about, again, language acquisition is a good example, being able to discern that, decode symbols and signs, basically. With the non-material, collection of data and classification, that's basically, reasoning and organizing information. With the material, we have comparative behavior and analysis. So comparative behavior is much more kind of physical interaction and reading that. With exertion, there's the hypothesis and synthesis. And again, a hypothesis would be creating an intention, basically. And then at the end, observing and divergent thinking. This ties into, I think, kind of an extrasensory perception, kind of beyond the known. You're divergent thinking, and potentially the creation of new ideas. And that's cells as a being. And basically what I want to do is take a look at the glossary or nomenclature of this exposition in part one. With the first part, with the cells as a building, we use structural functional theory. And that is a method of interpretation and analysis of aspects of human cognition, behavior, culture, and experience that focuses on relationships of contrast between elements in a conceptual system that reflects patterns underlying superficial diversity. This theory was created by Herbert Spencer, He was a philosopher, biologist, anthropologist, and sociologist. He also coined the term, after the kind of advent of Darwinism, survival of the fittest. Post-structural monolithic functional theory is what we used for the structural elements of life as a being. And again, that's taking a system and combining it into a single entity or monolithic functional structure. That is a method of interpretation and synthesis of aspects of human cognition, behavior, culture, and experience that focuses on the relationships of resemblance between elements in a conceptual system that reflect consistency underlying a superficial unity. This was made by myself, an artist and thought leader. That brings us to the end of part 1 of the 2020 Vision Pro. I hope this is something you were able to digest. Maybe you can look back on and sit back and kind of start to understand what these frameworks are doing. And join me again for part 2 and 3 of the 2020 Vision Pro.